Now with this floating platform, we can either assume that it's floating up there magically, or we can create some sort of terrain that supports it, but doesn't get in the way. And here's what I mean. If you were to come in, and just on a new layer for safety, you were to say, I don't know, I want to make this that, so that it actually is coming from the ground. The thing that would probably happen, was that players wouldn't understand that this is just that you can walk by, right? If you have your little guy there, you would probably assume that you'd have to do this, okay, and then go down, that you couldn't go through here. But what if you want that to be a part of the mechanic? What if you want to say, no, you can jump over or you can go underneath? How do you do that, but still maintain this sort of explanation on why your platform isn't floating? Well, what you can do is, let me just call this support. What you can do is you can create a shape underneath of this, tile-based again, you know, made out of tiles, but that you could shade differently, and that would be the thing. So bring up your grid. And depending on what shape you want to give it, I would suggest, you know, not exaggerating much. So let's try just a few contour lines and see what that looks like. So I'll use not the darkest shade, not this bounce light shade, but let's pick the darkest one and just desaturate it a little, or make it lighter, just like that. And in this case, I'm going to use 120, and then 100, and then 70. And I'm going to start doing some shapes. Now, I don't want to start like in the middle of the tile, because I have to remember that I'll be using this tile again. So you'll either start at the corners and do like a curve, or like a curve underneath, just like this. Or you want to do the side very close to the edge, or very close to this edge. So here's what I'll do. I'll do a side very close to the edge, and then I'll do a corner like this. And on this side, I'll do a corner like this, and then again very close to the edge. Okay? And if I paint that in, even though it's on a new layer, we should at least get some sense of a support there. Okay? Like that there's something behind. Right now, I don't think the color is right. So I'll bring up my hue and saturation and play around with it just a little bit. See what we get. I think it should be darker and less saturated. Actually, maybe lighter would be... Lighter probably wouldn't work, so we'd have to find a color that would match the background. I think something like this would be a better bet. So let's pick that color, see what it looks like. So 120, 110, and 85. Well, let's do 120, 120, and then 90. Okay? And we'll paint that back in using the lock transparency. Yeah, I think that kind of works, at least for the purpose of this explanation. Now with the Erase It tool, we're going to create a shape that we like. Okay? Because this is supposed to be terrain, so you might want to do like, for example, you might want to do a rock here, like a big rock, and then a smaller one there, and then you come in and shade it in. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing we did for the platform. We're going to get the sky color by control clicking, and then we'll bring the brush opacity down to 30%, and we're going to paint that over. Okay, so pick that color, bring the opacity back to 100, and now you have that color to paint. But because this is just a background element, you really don't want to go into detail on the inside. You really just want to stick around the background, because that will reinforce the silhouette and not create enough distracting elements for the player to be more concerned about what's going on in this not even collidable area instead of looking at your game. Okay, so just around the edge, maybe a little bit on the inside, but never go too far in, just so that you know that you've painted a rock, that this is a rock that you wanted to do. And okay, so maybe something like that. On the background, let's get some of the light to bounce back from the ground up to the surface, or sorry, to the terrain, like that. Maybe a little block there, maybe a little there. But again, don't go too crazy. And on the side here, just do vertical bounced light. Okay, let's just almost like if it was coming from directly from the side. Now this tile here is actually the same as this one, but flipped horizontally. Now it's not, it might be that your game engine doesn't allow for that, but let's assume for a moment that it does, just so that I can show you what happens. So considering the space that we have between these pixels and the outside, Control T, flip horizontal, you can see what happens when you have this situation. You see that sort of gap that happens there? Now this is very usual. This happens all the time in pixel art because you're trying to reuse art that you've made for something, you're trying to reuse it somewhere else, and maybe it's actually not the perfect fit, but it's such a tiny thing that you feel that the players won't know. So you might as well just save file size by not creating additional tiles, and as well you add more variety to your game. It's almost 100% sure that game players will prefer more variety and fuller environments that a bigger file size, and they will forgive a few things, unless they're really, really mean, which also, there's a lot of players out there who are very mean. But in this case, the only alternative for this is that instead of having, let me use a brighter shade. Instead of having the curve like that, starting from this pixel, what you could do is you could shift things around. And by that I mean you could get this tile, just this tile, move it up just a little bit so that part of the tile goes off. You select the part of it that's outside that you can't really see right now, and move this back down. So now, if you think about it, the way you made this tile is now that it's closer to the edge at the tip. Okay, so I'm going to delete the bottom one again, copy this, and then flip horizontal again. You can see that it still matches up, even without the selection. It still matches up. So Control T, it flip horizontal. We put it back where it's supposed to be, like a little bit to the left. I can use the cursor keys. And now you can see that the pixel on the edge actually hits pretty close to the original. Okay? So not only do you not have to go back in and create an extra tile, you manage to get away with a little trick, okay, with a little bit of simplicity. Now, it's always important to have a little bit of another tile, just so that it covers the backgrounds here. What about now with the shading? Does it look good? We can still play around, for example, with the levels, bring the contrast up a little bit, but you don't want it to be too contrasting. Otherwise, it will be an obstacle. Okay, actually, this would still work because it's so different from the environment that it would still work, but I think it's a little too dark. We might want to go with a hue and saturation. We might want to go a little more towards the red, maybe a little more saturation. And I think this would be enough to let the player know that that's a platform. Sorry for that. That that's a platform and you don't need to change it. And that's our mock-up so far.